It's been a funny 12 months, hasn't it? Normally, at Unison's higher education AGMs in Yorkshire, a regional official gives a short guest speech about the state of higher education in the region. However, with things being as they are, we've decided to try something a little different this year. We're joined today by Unison's Regional Manager for Higher Education, Leonie, and the Chair of the University of Leeds UNISON branch, Nick Allen. So, let's start with Leonie Sharp. So, Leonie, the higher education sector has undergone a lot of change in the last 10 years. What do you think those changes are, and how do you think they've affected Unison members?
Higher education sector is a big business now, isn't it? I mean, it's about getting as many students in as they possibly can within the caps, having as much income coming in through the tuition fees, making as much money as possible, and putting money into the reserves. How does that impact on our members? Well, we don't see the members getting, a commensurate pay rise whilst the income's, coming in. We see the impact on our members of having to work harder, work faster, work smarter, put in all the hours as possible. And it's a very different sector than it was, 10, 20 years ago.
It's a shift in the ethos. You used to have people would work at a university for 20, 30 years, and they would describe their own pride in working for an institution of that standing in the city, in the region. It would be a little thing you'd wear on your badge. I work for Leeds University. This is a good thing. They're a good thing. And now that is not as prevalent. And the universities, the management of the universities are the prime movers in creating that kind of environment.
Every member will be keen for an update on pay. We're in a situation where we still haven't resolved the 2020 pay offer, and we're heading now into 2021's negotiations. Leonie, do you think you can give a technical update on where the negotiations are?
2020 pay offer wasn't actually an offer at all. It was a pay freeze. There wasn't a percentage put by the employers. So therefore that was rejected by Unison, it was rejected by the other unions as well, and we went out and took an indicative ballot in November 2020, from which our members then said that they rejected the non-offer and wished for the union to pursue ahead through to a full industrial action ballot, which we're in the process of doing at the moment. In the meantime, we've moved into 2021 pay round, at which we're in discussions with the other trade unions to formulate what looks like a reasonable pay claim that we'll be putting forward.
Leonie described it as no pay offer being put on the table, so a pay freeze. But obviously that works out in real life as a pay cut once you see it against inflation. And this is what we've faced for the last 10 years. And our working conditions and the pay that we're given for it is on a downhill slope. There's something pretty funny about the universities going around the place claiming to be world class while they still have members of staff who have to use food banks.
So let's move on to the pandemic. Strategically, how do you feel the universities across Yorkshire have coped with the last 12 months, and what difference do you feel that Unison as a trade union has made?
There's 11 higher education institutes across the region, and they all did things very differently. I have to give some credit in that, the pandemic took us all by surprise. And so some universities went into immediate lockdown back in March 2020 and immediately closed campuses. I had students return back to their homes, whilst keeping on some students that didn't have homes to go to, and international students who couldn't leave. And some did very well in that. Other universities had our members coming in on campus as if it was normal. I had one university that I had to threaten the health and safety executive in because they were still having open days in March 2020, and students and families coming onto that particular campus. So it's been kind of a varied approach really by the universities.
So Nick Allen, as a trade unionist, what have been the standout moments of the pandemic from your perspective?
There are several things. I think the first and foremost is the commitment of our members in actually working to provide the services, the essential services on campus that are needed. Like Leonie said, there are some groups of students who, for one reason or another, can't leave campus. They have to stay in the residences, and they have done more or less for the whole of the pandemic, one way or the other. obviously, therefore, there's some ancillary staff that are needed, you know, the security guys, the people who work in residences, the people who look after the actual fabric of the university, the estates people. Those groups of staff have been there since March.
So, following on from that, when we think back to, especially to previous lockdowns, and we think about the staff that stayed behind on campus, one of the things that was really in my mind at the time was how those staff, more often than not, they were women, they were lower paid, and they tended to be older. What do you think the long-term effects of that will be, and how do you think universities can redress that?
Well, there's a lot in that, and I think the impact on women through the pandemic has been considerable from all sides. And it's not, most of these women, many of these women are often dual carers, you know, caring for children or grandchildren and their elderly parents at the same time, and travelling in on public transport, you know, potentially having to have their wages topped up with universal credit. You know, okay, maybe at the moment getting an additional £20 a week, but threatened that that's going to be lost too. I mean, they're you know, also potentially having a partner at home who's lost their job because of the pandemic. I mean, it's just been totally squeezed from all sides. What can employers do? Well, first off, they need to give them a decent pay rise so that people aren't, you know, worried that they're going to lose £20 a week universal credit, or as Nick had said, you know, having to revert to food banks.
So finally then, Nick Allen, the pandemic really has split Unison members in higher education into two groups of workers, those who worked from home and those who remain behind on campus. From your position, what have been the main challenges facing each group of workers?
Okay, well, I mean, there are, as you say, two very different sets of staff now and two very different sets of problems. I should be clear, I'm a clerical member of staff, so I've been working from home since March. I haven't been onto campus since March the 23rd. The problems in that group of staff are things like isolation, things like loneliness, particularly if the people live alone. Also, the difficulty of working conditions at home. A lot of, you know, homes just aren't set up to be workplaces. Flip side to that is some people in that category very much wanted to be back onto campus for whatever reason, whether it was their mental health or whether it wasn't a safe place to be at home. And then the people who are on campus are faced with the idea that they're looking at this threat, which is a new threat to everybody, which we were only learning about and continue to learn about from last March. And who knew what was safe at that point? The rules back in March that the government laid down for essential workers were very different from what they are for this lockdown, and that's been a cause of a lot of problems. University staff have been moved into critical worker status. The universities have a much freer hand in insisting that certain groups of workers who weren't in March should now be on campus. It's difficult when you've got two different sets of competing requirements or needs. The students have one set and the staff have another set, and making those two coexist happily is a very big challenge.
Leonie, Nick Allen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.